I have been searching.
Welcome to Following the Fire, a podcast for Christians who are rethinking their faith and need a safe place to doubt. As we wander through the spiritual wilderness, we want to find and follow God wherever the pillar of fire leads.
And just like God's people in the Bible, we get lost, we miss the point, and we don't have all the answers. But maybe that's okay. We're on this journey together. I'm Nathan.
And I'm Steve.
Even on my heart.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 47. I am so unabashedly excited about our guest today. When I came across this guy's TikTok account last year, I immediately devoured most of the now 700 videos he has posted. Dan McClellan is a biblical scholar, translator, and expert in the ancient Near East and the cognitive science of religion. And my daughter's made fun of me for fangirling, quote unquote, about having him on today, but I don't care. He's got great things to say. But I'm going to stop talking now and let Dan introduce himself properly. Take it away, Dan.
All right. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I appreciate the invitation and for having me. My name is Dan McClellan. I'm on TikTok as McClellan, @McClellan, and that's a phonetic spelling of my last name that I used when I was living in South America because they don't like those consonant clusters down there. But it's McClellan. I'm also on Instagram and Twitter with the same handle, and I do slightly different stuff on Instagram, and then Twitter is basically just political stuff. So if you really want to get upset with me, that's where you can go. But I live in Utah. I work currently as the scripture translation supervisor for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and people always ask me, what does that mean? And it's simple. I supervise the translation of the scriptures. So all our Latter-day Saints scripture gets translated into a variety of other languages. So I go find people who may be qualified to be translators and reviewers, interview them, vet them, train them, and then supervise the projects. And because my specialization is biblical languages, I am our main person for our Bible projects, which are not translated from scratch. We take public domain translations that we have used for a long time that we have preferred, and we revise and update them. But my background is in biblical studies. I have a bachelor's degree in ancient Near Eastern studies from Brigham Young University. Then I went to Oxford for a master's degree in Jewish studies. Went to Canada to a university called Trinity Western University for another master's degree in biblical studies, and then completed a couple of years ago my PhD in theology and religion at the University of Exeter. And people think that means I'm a theologian, but that's just the name of the department there. Your PhD is just PhD in name of department. But I wrote my dissertation there on the cognitive science of religion and the conceptualization of deity in the Hebrew Bible. So I work a lot with cognitive linguistics, cognitive science of religion, conceptualization of deity, conceptualization of scripture, as well as religious identity. So that's kind of my wheelhouse. That's where I like to operate. And I started, let's see, what is it? It's the 16th. I think it was the last week of March last year that I started my TikTok account. So it will almost be it's almost a year on the dot that I started. So it's been a crazy year, but it's been a lot of fun. I've met a lot of great people. Been able to do some interviews like this, and once we are in a non-COVID world again, I look forward to meeting some of these folks in person too. I think it'd be great to do some get-togethers and things like that.
Yeah, we're not far away, just over the mountains.
In
Fort Collins, Colorado.
Oh, Fort Collins, So you will know, I lived in Colorado for a long time. In fact, I got kicked out of the University of Northern Colorado up in Greeley. I have been to my fair share of college parties that we need not go into in Fort Collins and down in Boulder as well. So most of my family lives in Denver right now.
Oh, really?
Wow.
Yeah.
Small world.
Yeah, it is. And Colorado is a wonderful place. In fact, we are going to be there this coming weekend to go hang out with some family.
So what made you pick up a phone and go, I think I'll start doing really complicated, critical biblical scholarship on TikTok?
Well, I have been on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter for a while, and I was aware of TikTok, and every now and then I would see people share stuff from TikTok, and then I started to see people sharing posts that were kind of related to what I do, and I wondered, is anybody keeping tabs on these people over here on TikTok? And I got an account and I lurked for a little bit. Basically, just wanted to see what test the waters a little bit, see what things were like. And there are a lot of great folks who are trying to get into biblical scholarship and understand it better, and some remarkably insightful people. But it struck me that there wasn't a real credentialed expert there kind of playing referee, as you said. And, I tend to probably think more highly of myself than I should. So I thought, hey, I might as well throw my hat into the ring and see what I can do to help not only try to combat a lot of the disinformation that is out there, but also try to help democratize access to some of this scholarship, some of this information, because I know there are a lot of people out there who have a desire to better understand the Bible from a devotional point of view, but also folks who want to just understand this information just so they can have a better understanding of the world around them and engage with maybe the history or the text of the Bible, or friends, family, and others who approach it devotionally. And so I started trying to make videos with this view of becoming a bit of a popularizer of biblical scholarship, making it a little more accessible for folks on TikTok, and also combat some disinformation. And yeah, that was almost a year ago. So I'll have to do something special for my 1 year anniversary.
Yeah, I was curious if you had, if that has changed how you approach studying the scriptures or looking into things, or looking at it from a more, like you said, a populist standpoint.
I think it has, maybe not the way that I approach these questions, but it has definitely brought to my attention a much broader set of concerns and questions. I've become much more aware of what kinds of questions the general public, at least the sampling that is available to me on TikTok, what kind of questions they have, what's important to them, what kinds of worries they have, and what kind of biases they have. So I've always just approached my study by just considering what I want to learn about and what questions I have. But now I think I've broadened my perspective, my gaze a little bit, in order to, I think, be a little more flexible for the audience that I have on TikTok. So whereas I used to maybe have a little bit more tunnel vision and just look at the things I was personally interested in, now when I run across something, I'm like, oh, I've had questions about this before. I know people will want to know this. I better get this book, or I better read this article, or something like that. So I think it has made me a bit more of a generalist in that regard. And then I am thinking about how to frame things so that it's a lot more accessible. Because I can be very, very jargony and technical in my writing. And in fact, I got an award at Oxford for the master's thesis that I wrote. And the chair of the department who got up to give me the award, even he was like, I don't understand exactly what the title of your thesis means, but here you go. So I can be kind of dense that way, but TikTok is definitely helping me find a more accessible voice. And it is helping me think about how I would describe these things to a general public audience rather than to other academic nerds like me. And I think that is very helpful. I am grateful for that.
Yeah, it forces you to just think of things differently.
It does.
I think.
I'm interested in kind of what some of those questions are. What are some of those questions that you get the most that maybe as a biblical scholar, that's not what you would have been discovering in class, but that the average TikToker is asking, cares about?
I found that a lot of the things that tend to pop up are things that relate to the relationship of critical, skeptical, critical thinking people to family, their own past in the church institutions. So things that have to do with their own sense of self-worth, the idea of an afterlife, what kind of reward/punishment scheme do the scriptures actually promote, if any, and a lot of things that have to do with some of the hot-button identity politics that are going on today with homosexuality in the Bible, the question of, is there a concept of hell, of eternal divine punishment? People want to know about where the Bible came from. The process of canonization is always a hot topic. Did Jesus exist? Mythicism. I've always known that mythicism was something that for some reason seems to stick around, but that there are a lot of strong feelings about that. A lot of things that's, I feel like the general public is still aware of data that is very outdated, but sticks around because it serves the interest of identity politics, of one group or another, either advocating for the interests of a conservative religious position or advocating against those interests. And so in that sense, they're kind of battleground issues that most people are dealing with. Some of this stuff is literally 19th century. Like, people haven't been making these arguments for over a century, and people are still bringing them up.
Yeah, that kind of gets into the data over dogma thing that you talk a lot about. Can you explain what that means?
Well, when I got into things, I wanted to frame my approach, my channel, the product that I was putting out there, as a place where you could find just the data. Now, I'm interpreting things as well, but I want to provide the data in a way that isn't obviously in the service of some group's structuring of power or another. And so I get a lot of people who will start following my account, and I get the impression that they think I'm on their quote unquote team. And I'm not really on any teams. And so there will always be people that will say, I thought you were different. I thought you felt this way or that way. And I have to clarify, I'm just here to share the data. And if you think that the data is going to support your team unilaterally, you are woefully misguided. Sometimes the data sides with a more conservative perspective. Sometimes it does not. Sometimes the data doesn't help anybody. It's just kind of out there, and both sides are clearly, too deeply embedded in a dogmatic position. And so I can't remember where I first started saying it, but I started saying if I have a motto, it's that I'm about data over dogma, because dogma is usually rooted in identity politics. And from my work in cognitive sciences, I get the distinct impression that identity politics have a lot to do with a lot of the arguments and the discourse that takes place in the public. And so I want to be separated from that, and I want to be able to provide the data instead of support dogmatism.
That really reminds me of, I think we, as lay people, I'm a lay person, we understand maybe physics, if you're going to study physics, that there's some certain assumptions you have to bring to the table if you're going to set up an experiment. There's certain things that you kind of have to assume, or that you're not going to bring into the table. And then at the end of it, you get to use significant figures to report how certain you were in your result, and then somebody's going to be able to replicate it.
Yeah.
When you talk about history or literature, or adding more and more complicated subjects like that, like religion or other cultures, what are some of the maybe assumptions that you kind of have to bring to the table as a critical scholar that maybe I wouldn't know about, or that a layperson kind of may not be bringing to a devotional text?
A lot of what we do is try to avoid a lot of the assumptions that we might kind of intuitively bring to the question, because a lot of people talk about proving things, and in history and linguistics and studying texts, there is remarkably little that we can prove. We deal with weighing probabilities and saying this is more likely than that. And if we can actually get to the point where we're actually proving something, that's pretty rare. But a number of assumptions that we have to deal with relate to, the possibility of supernatural stuff. This is something that I get all the time, particularly in debates about things like the resurrection, where people say, well, when you look at all this data, it's so much more likely that Jesus rose from the dead than anything else. It's like you can't really add something that is physically impossible to a set of possibilities and treat it as if it is on the same level as, somebody had a delusion or somebody just really wanted to believe something happened. And that's an issue I've gotten into apologists with a lot, because there is a notion that the assumptions of the supernatural that are associated with the miracles of the Bible are on the same level as the assumptions of naturalism, that things are follow a set of rules that we can, for the most part, detect, not always perfectly, but we're putting together a much better view, a much better perspective on what all these rules are. And a lot of people talk about a naturalist, a set of assumptions from a naturalistic point of view. And there are definitely things that we have to assume related to history that, I wish we had a piece of paper we could rub on a text and it would turn pink, and then we would know, oh, this means this and not the other thing. But we're working with a limited data set. We're working with theoretical frameworks that we've tried to develop from the data, and we do our best to try to keep dogmatism out of that, to try to keep assumptions out of that. But we're humans, and in a century from now, people are going to look back on how we study ancient texts or the archaeology and think we were a bunch of rubes, because they're going to have much more refined theoretical models. But they're always going to be theoretical models, and there's a saying that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, and that's basically what we're trying to do. We're trying to find the models that are the most useful. And there's always going to be distance between the cold, hard reality and what we are able to reconstruct, what we are able to detect, what we are able to perceive. But we want to try to keep as much as possible assumptions deriving from authority, or deriving from who has money, or deriving from how I can sell more books. We want to try to keep those assumptions out of things as much as possible. And it's difficult. And none of us are perfect at it.
Yeah. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but saying data over dogma doesn't mean that dogma is never useful.
Yeah. And maybe I haven't made that as clear as several months ago, but I've said many times, that's not to say that dogma is necessarily a bad thing. We all live and die based on dogmas. There's not a human being alive who has ever lived a dogma-free life. They're a part of life. But I want to try to present a channel where we can try to mitigate that as much as possible, so that we can produce some data that will be the most helpful to the most people. But I'm would never claim that I'm entirely dogma free. and I think recently someone asked me about that, what dogmas I had, and I said probably the one that I feel the most strongly about is, all other things being equal, I will always give the benefit of the doubt to a less powerful group over and against a more powerful group. So that's a dogma. I run into that one. I would say if I am appealing to dogmas regularly, that's probably the one I appeal to most commonly.
It's not a bad one.
I don't think so. I mean, I have, I've lived, I haven't had the easiest life in the world, but so many people have had much harder lives. And I've seen, as I was a missionary for my church down in Uruguay, I lived down there for 2 years. And I've seen the kinds of things that I had never experienced up here and that I will never experience. And I came back home and I wanted to get to know this whole side of America that I was never exposed to before, the side of America that speaks Spanish. And so I did. I made a bunch of friends who didn't really speak much English, and I had a great time getting to know that culture around me in Dallas, Texas. And it opened my eyes to how much everything here is structured to prioritize my interests over and against theirs. Mm. And I think that really changed things for me. And so yeah, that's one of the reasons if I appeal to a dogma every day, it's going to be that one.
I suppose if history gets to be written by the conquerors, why not interpret history in the lens of those who are conquered or those who are not in power?
That's that's the principle of People's History of the United States. Zinn's very phenomenal book because those stories don't get told. And I think when we imagine our history through the lens of the conquerors, there's so much that we lose.
Yeah, what you're talking about, data over dogma, and the dogmas of specifically the one you're talking about, like the oppressed over the oppressor. Mm-hmm. It actually kind of made me think about like how I would come back to the study of the Bible stuff. How the way I grew up in a Church of Christ. Both Nathan and I did, and so the dogma was so strong. I remember. I got my degree in biblical studies at Oklahoma Christian University, and I remember taking like a class on Matthew, and the professor came in and talked about it, like, well, authorship. It's definitely Matthew, and some people talk about Q, but that's kind of going away, and we're all this stuff, and it's like the realities of some of these things were so important that are so unimportant, I should say, that the dogma ruled all. And even when it comes to some of how we treat people around us, if we feel like the dogma is stronger than the person next to me, then I'm going to believe the thing I believe at your expense. Mm-hmm. And that's so hard to pull those apart.
It is, and I remember seeing the same thing when I did my second master's degree. That was at a Trinity Western University, an evangelical school. And I remember I had one of the members of my cohort there. He had just come out of an MDiv, and like second week of one of our Old Testament survey classes, we start getting into Pentateuchal authorship. And he was like, wait a minute. In my MDiv, they told us that the documentary hypothesis wasn't a thing anymore. And the professor had obviously dealt with this many times. But he was like, yeah, that's something that in seminaries they misunderstand. They think the restructuring of the JEDP source critical models means that they're abandoning source criticism and going back to Mosaic authorship, and that's just not the case. But it does not get filtered all the way down because those schools, they have a certain way they want to teach their students. And so it gets down to them as, scholars are abandoning source criticism. And so that rocked this student's world for a couple of weeks. Took him a while to be able to digest that and be okay with it.
Yeah, same thing goes for me. I've studied I got my degree like 20 years ago or something, and was a missionary myself and a youth minister and all this stuff. And it's taken like a decade for me to start kind of processing through some of this stuff. Mm-hmm. It's just so ingrained in you. And then figuring out what to do with the Bible now that you feel like the reason you believed it is not as solid as it was before.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. That's something that I see a lot on TikTok is I get that question. If it's not all 100% true, then how can you trust any of it? And that was never, I had a weird upbringing, but that was never a thought that entered my head. Like, that never would have computed for me, because I came to approaching the Bible as an adult from what I would consider a mostly critical point of view. And so that was never something that I was ever... that was never an idea I ever had about how to approach the Bible. So I can empathize to some degree, but it is always artificial. I have never had that experience, but I have seen other people go through it. And I still remember a long conversation I had in the parking lot for a couple of hours after a class at this evangelical university with a couple of the students from the class, where they were talking about what to do with this information. But then the conversation switched to, and how do we get this information to the other Christians out there? How do we help them understand this? Because, we are paying to come to school to be taught this. Not everybody has that luxury. And so do we just pretend like we have two different tiers of approaches to the Bible? You've got your academic Christians and everybody else, or is there a way to help everybody understand it this way? So I've seen folks in the evangelical world wrestle with these questions, and yeah, it's difficult. There's no easy answer.
Open the window to a sky full of clouds.
That's such a topic that I think we see over and over, where there's this, even just from let's say a regular person to a practicing Christian's understanding of the Bible, there's a lot of air, there's a lot of distance. Mm-hmm. But then to someone in seminary, there's a lot of, like, that's a complete new understanding of the Bible. And then in actual biblical scholarship and PhDs in culture and in language, it seems like it just makes the gap bigger and bigger between what you know and what I might know or assume about the Bible. Mm-hmm. And I think your TikTok probably is very much trying to reduce that gap. But what kind of issues do you see that are kind of those common gaps where we're either in the popular culture or even in the religious devotional culture where we haven't quite caught up, or where the scholarship hasn't found out the way to communicate back down to us? Yeah,
I think one of the ones that I harp on the most is probably univocality. This idea that the Bible speaks with a single, consistent, and unified voice. I mean, that's really at the foundation of a lot of scholarship, because if you're approaching a text and the notion that a book could have been written by two or more different authors in different time periods is not even on the table, that is going to significantly change what you're able to extract from that text. But once you allow that, this could be a composite text, the work of two or any number of authors and editors and redactors and scribes over centuries and centuries. That really opens up a whole new world to what this text could have meant in its different phases. And so I think that's one of the biggest hurdles when it comes to talking to folks who approach the Bible devotionally and have that perspective. That's one of the things that does not compute for them most often. And so I think if I can help people get over that, I think that's the biggest thing. But one of the things that I've taken from the world of cognitive linguistics, as well as the cognitive science of religion, is how so much of what we understand is not a pristine and unfiltered view of reality as it is, but is a construal of data based on conventionalized frameworks and ways of speaking and ways of thinking and ways of organizing knowledge. And this took me a long time to kind of draw a bead on. But I use as an illustration the concept of truth. When we talk about truth today, truth is an object. You can hide the truth, you can find the truth, you can give the truth, you can withhold the truth. There can be the whole truth. You can have parts, halves, and wholes of it. Truth is an object. That is a conceptual metaphor that we use when we think and talk about truth. We don't think that we're doing this, but we're actually taking this concept, this abstract concept, and we're turning it into an object in our minds. But when we read the Bible, truth is a path. You walk in the truth. You follow after the truth. You have departed from the truth. You need to return to the truth. They didn't think of it as an object. They thought of it as a path, because that was the conventionalized way of structuring their knowledge that they used back then. And it seems like such a small thing, but it can make such a big difference in how we interpret what's going on in the text. And even truth itself, not just how we conceptualize it, but what truth meant. Truth back then was not, is your proposition in alignment with reality? Truth and faith and belief and all these kinds of things were about trust. Do you trust this person, this proposition? Not necessarily that it is in alignment with reality, but that it is going to produce the results that are desired. And so there's a saying from a book. There's a phrase in Latin. I don't remember the phrase in Latin, but as it goes, is your philosophy true means, is your love of knowledge genuine? But then came the Enlightenment. And now it means, is your belief, is your proposition accurate? And so there are a bunch of different ways that we construct the world around us in our minds, that cognitive linguistics, cognitive science of religion, evolutionary psychology, all these other approaches have kind of opened up these different ways of thinking about how we approach the Bible for me that I find fascinating. And I think I kind of, I throw people off a lot with some of the ways that I talk about this, because it is pretty heady. But things like religion, the concept of religion being something that develops slowly, starting in the Islamic period, and then really taking off with the Reformation and, the Renaissance, then the Reformation and the Enlightenment. So to talk about religion in the biblical period is an anachronism. They never would have thought of religion as any kind of discrete, separable domain of thinking or knowledge or cultural practice. And so we distort the Bible when we talk about, this is something that's religious. So that area, I'm still trying to figure out how to present all of this stuff to my TikTok audience without just kind of confusing the crap out of them, which is what frequently happens. And this,
I think.
Go ahead.
I'm processing at about 1/10 the speed that you're talking, because I'm someone who deals with like 2-syllable words and lower. But just to bring that full circle, so blowing our minds with univocality, I can barely even say it, where maybe you could read a text and see the changes or the seams, maybe, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But as someone who goes to the Bible bookstore and picks up a bound copy of capital B, the Bible, and then kind of makes some assumptions about it and what it would mean for it to be true, as a Westerner, I think truth is the object. So it would be untrue to have modified this thing from its original source. That would be kind of counter to, if that was a newspaper article, that would be some kind of a crime. Mm-hmm. But true as a plumb line or true as a path, you can follow, you could, in full pursuit of the truth, go into a document as maybe a rabbi in some period and make a change or add something to make something and continue that truth. And it reminds me of Harry Potter.
Yeah.
The first book of Harry Potter is called Harry Potter and the...
Yeah, philosopher or sorcerer.
Yeah, philosopher or sorcerer. So the original author said Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Mm-hmm. But some really smart marketing executive in America realized that selling a children's book about wizards to kids, it's going to make a lot more sense to say Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, right?
Yep.
They modified the name in the pursuit of that truth as a plumb line or a path. Like, it makes a lot more sense. This isn't a book about philosophy. It's a book about wizards, right? But ignoring, maybe, if you're a historian, you might know that, I don't know, the history of the actual Philosopher's Stone idea and alchemy and what that means. But it's a children's book, so it's actually more true to take this thing and modify it for your audience and what they know, and give them a result that they can understand, actually more true than the original author's intent. It's crazy.
Yeah. And I think there's a degree to which there is a desire to push back against that, to treat that as relativism, as postmodernism. But I think people would be surprised how much, one, they do that already, and two, how much easier it would make that message to be able to adapt and adopt it to the audiences. So people don't have to conform to the message, but the message can conform to some degree to them. But I think that's an interesting way to frame that. I haven't thought about it in relation to Harry Potter before.
You just stick around. Nathan has some interesting ways to look at things. So the idea of univocality is something that, I think that word, it was the first time I heard it was when you said it on these TikTok things.
You know what? I don't know where I got it from. I just started saying it several years ago. And in academic circles, people are like, yeah, okay. So I was like, all right, it must make sense.
It works for me. I mean, but it seems like it kind of comes along. It's like hand in hand with the concept of inerrancy.
I think there's a lot of truth to that. Yeah.
And you seem to know a lot about not just some of these philosophical things around religion and scripture, but like the history of it. So where did we get this idea of univocality and inerrancy? Is that like a development over time, or just pop up one day? Or
I think so. I think you see different degrees to which some of the early Christian writers made assertions about what kind of truth is in the text. Now again, their conceptualization of truth is not exactly the same as ours. But I think there was kind of a de facto expectation that the principles that were in the text would always lead to God. So whether or not the text was literally true was not whether it was historical, whether it was scientifically true, that was just not in view. But was it true in the sense of, is it trustworthy? And they would have said, absolutely, yeah, unilaterally. And they had different ways to approach it. One of the big issues facing early Christianity was what to do with the Hebrew Bible. You had Marcion in the 2nd century who wanted to get rid of it entirely, but the case was made that we needed to keep it. And that meant you had to find ways to read texts like Psalm 137 that says, blessed is he who takes your young babies and smashes them against the rocks. Yeah. And so they had to come up with a way to interpret that, to make it from God. And that required new and different frameworks. And so you have a development of a bunch of different ways to approach the text. You had your moral readings, your historical readings, all these metaphorical readings. You had Christians coming up with a bunch of different ways to approach the text. And some of them made the text not necessarily historical, but that didn't make them less quote unquote true. And I think this was primarily how people dealt with things up until around the time of the Reformation and the Enlightenment, because you had a lot of fighting over what the Bible meant. And one thing that happened with the Enlightenment was rationalism. And rationalism was very positivistic. Rationalists believed that you could determine the truth or the falsity or falsehood of propositions, in a binary manner. This is all true or all false. And a lot of this was based on the reviving classical philosophical perspectives, particularly those associated with Aristotle and with Plato. And so one of the things, and I think I see this a lot today in the way people talk about the Bible, is this notion that everything is a dichotomy and it is either true or it is false. And that can be, we can establish those, or we must be able to establish those for every question that we ask. And I think this is why we have the arguments that we do today. And in the 19th century, with the question of evolution and the implications of evolution for things like slavery, made that such an important fight. And so inerrancy, I think, it kind of bubbles to the surface of all of these arguments as a way to draw a line and say it has to be 100% inerrant, no mistakes whatsoever, because to allow for any mistakes is to be on the wrong side of that dichotomy of true or false. And so I think that's what incentivizes people to adopt and assert a notion that on its face would seem so absurd, but it is so critical to so many people's faiths these days that it is something that they're willing to adopt. And that's what makes that's why when I come around and say, yeah, that's all crap, they get very upset with me. And it's not an easy thing to overcome, because, and this is what the whole deconstruction movement is about. You have to take this framework of how the Bible is, that has been constructed literally over centuries. And, it takes a long time to learn that whole framework, but it is given to you in a specific way. And you have to take that framework, and you can't just annihilate it all at once. That would be devastating for that person. You have to sit there and take it apart piece by piece and find the pieces that you think still belong and find the pieces that don't, and then reconstruct what you want to salvage from this, or just leave it behind and move on. That's what deconstruction is about. And that's how I think that is how you take what the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, 19th century debates about creationism and its relevance to slavery, what all of that has constructed and given to us, you have to, deal with it piece by piece, or just throw your hands up and walk away. And most people, that's a non-starter for most people.
It's like a month. Spring is coming, but I
really identify with your coming back to the idea of trust. And I think a lot of the questions you probably get, whether it's about canon or translations, probably the root is, when I open this, the version that I have in my lap, can I put my trust in it? You know what I mean? And if there's a change in authorship or something, then that makes me a little bit nervous. Or if there's a difficulty in translating a word or a passage or even a concept, that makes me a little bit nervous about the amount of trust that I'm going to put in my version that I have. Mm-hmm. How do you address that idea for what's the difference between maybe an errant and a faithful text? And when you compare maybe the Hebrew scriptures to other near ancient texts, or just any ancient text, religious or otherwise, how do you kind of convey the history and the scholarship to someone who maybe is unfamiliar with how that came to be and how that compares to other documents?
Well, one of the things that I do in an effort to maintain the data over dogma is I try not to be someone's guide to maintaining a faithful perspective. And there are a number of reasons for that. But folks like Pete Enns, I think, do a great job of saying this is what critical scholarship does, but this is why we don't have to throw it all away. So have y'all read his book, The Bible Tells Me So?
I've read how the Bible works.
How the Bible works. I've not actually read that one, but The Bible Tells Me So is I think addresses that question. Says this is how we tend to think about the Bible, but scholarship would tell you that's not actually what it's there for, but that doesn't mean we have to throw it all away. And my approach has been to try to not differentiate the text from any other text that I would read. Approach it exactly as I would read any other text, and see what comes out the other side. And I know some folks who will take that and then will reconstruct the results a little differently, because they take what I will say as kind of raw data, and then say, well, here are the assumptions that I am willing to bring to this and reconstruct the text so that it serves their theological interests. But one of the things that I think we should all be aware of is that everybody is in a constant, well, everyone who approaches the Bible from a devotional, confessional point of view is always in a process of renegotiation. Because every time they go to the Bible, they're going to it with a different set of frameworks. Because every new day that we put under our belts provides a new set of lenses with which to look at the world. And over the generations, groups have to reinterpret the text in order for it to remain relevant to them, in order for it to inform their experiences and help them look to the future. And that happens on an individual level. It happens on a group level, and so we're always reconstructing our understanding of the Bible every time we approach it. Now we may be, the difference between how one person approaches it today and how they approach it tomorrow is going to be pretty negligible. But the difference between the way a teenager approaches the Bible and the way a mother of 5 approaches the Bible, or that teenager when they, 15 years down the road, is going to be significant. They don't have the same readings of the text because they're not looking at it through the same lenses, and they're not looking for the same results from the text. And so different lenses, different needs are going to produce different results. So I think that I still approach everything on TikTok and things like that, in my public approach to the Bible, it is entirely critical. But for those who want to take it and do something confessional or devotional with it, understand that there's no way to approach it as a static text. It is always a dynamic, changing text and we are in a constant process of renegotiating with it.
Yeah, it kind of makes me think of the, it seems like just recently you did a few videos about apologetics. And
yeah, I was forced into it.
I mean, apologetics was like my jam when I was like in high school, like anything, like you said in your videos, it's all built around finding one possible, maybe plausible thing, and then therefore that like ends the discussion. And how it seems like apologetics is an attempt to look at the scripture as this static thing and to come to it with almost nothing but dogma, and then shape everything around that belief. And I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it just made me. I saw drawing the connections there.
Yeah, and I think that raises that apologetics today is so much different from apologetics in the early church, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, because we do have that binary now of this is either true or false. And as long as they can wedge that little sliver of not impossible in there, it means it's not false. Therefore, it's the other thing. Or at least there's the potential that it is the other thing.
Yeah, and that's where I was going with it. It's this concept of the black and white of
Yeah.
it's either right or it's wrong that kind of came along with the Enlightenment, and how it's so hard for us to put ourselves back in the mindset of somebody or a culture that does not always think that way, or approaching reading a book as, I guess I just every time I sit down with the Bible or a book about the Bible, it's like I spend half my time trying to peel away the things I was told about the Bible and about Scripture, and how holy those words are, and how they are directly from the Word of God, and God guided the pen of the authors and all that stuff, and trying to at the same time read those things. I try to read those things critically and study and learn from people like you, but then also be okay with the fact that doesn't preclude some of the supernatural stuff. I mean, just because I can't prove it doesn't mean it necessarily is not there. And it's just this constant like running in circles, it seems like. And I've talked to a lot of Christians who feel a similar way, especially quote unquote deconstructing folks.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to figure out where the Bible, like, what's the Bible good for? Because we do have this tendency to just toss it out.
Yeah. And I think that's another vestige of the Reformation is this reduction of religion to a question of, are your propositions true?
Yeah.
Which is something that I talked about a while ago, because in the cognitive science of religion, not only can you not really distill down religion to any essence, but there are so many different dimensions of religion and experience and phenomenology for so many different people that to just say, well, it's either true or false is a non sequitur. It totally misses the mark, because there are plenty of people out there who are faithful practitioners of a religion who are 100% atheists. I have some good friends who are 100% atheists and Jewish and participate in all of the celebrations, all the rites, light the candles, and say the prayers and do everything, and are 100% atheists. And to reduce religion to, is your set of propositions true, is, I think, a remarkably myopic approach that serves the structuring of power of folks engaged on both sides of this, but I think does an incredible injustice to the folks who are living their religion for any one of a variety of different combinations of reasons. And so I know folks who approach the Bible not because they think it has inerrant truths in it, but because of the way it makes them feel, or because it reminds them of things that are important to them, whether or not these are literally historical or true. It's important to them, and they like that feeling. And people will dismiss that, say that's not a valid foundation for a worldview, but nobody really has the authority to say what you are and are not allowed to build your worldview off of, as long as you're not hurting people, which unfortunately a lot of people are.
Yeah, it's as long as you're not hurting people is an important asterisk there, and it's almost like saying, is it true that you should love your neighbor as yourself? Is a question that is it meaningful that you should love your neighbor as yourself? You could certainly answer, I could make a lot more money if I don't love my neighbor as myself, or I could be a lot more happy if I don't love my neighbor as myself. And
who precisely is this neighbor that we're talking about anyway? Where can I draw the line?
Yeah, anything but whatever a Samaritan is where I draw the line.
I know soon the sun will break through and I'll feel your light. Open the window to a sky full of clouds.
I've saved, I don't know if you do have this, Steve, but I saved a couple of pet questions that I have anytime I get to talk to a biblical scholar, just so that I can answer the weird, interesting things that I have.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to do this one, and I might be completely off base, so feel free to knock me off of my pedestal, Dan. So as a Westerner, I have this belief that just like your average person out there in the West tends to think that God looks like Zeus in AKA Monty Python and the Holy Grail God.
Mm-hmm.
And my comment is, let's see which one I should say first. What did Israelites think about God when they pictured God, and did they think God looked like a cow?
So, that was the topic of my second master's thesis. How did they conceptualize deity? And I whittled it down to two main, what I call divine profiles. And this is based on the initial distinction between Adonai and El. But El was, if we take the Ugaritic literature, if we take some of the other surrounding literature as drawn from the same kind of sociocultural matrix, if we can use that as an analogy with which to add flesh to kind of the skeletal descriptions that we get in the Bible, we can reconstruct El as a patriarchal high deity who had, a long flowing beard and white hair and was benevolent and kind. And from the Ugaritic literature, also was a philanderer and liked to get drunk. But I don't know that all transfers to the Bible. But we picture El as an older patriarchal figure with a long beard and long white hair seated on a throne. And then the Adonai profile is based more closely on Baal, one of the sons of El, who was a warrior figure, a storm deity, and their disposition was represented by violent weather. And so they were youthful, they were virile, and they were a warrior. So this figure in some of the material media that has survived is frequently represented in a standing, striding pose, so one foot in front of the other with one hand raised. They call it the smiting pose, and they would have had a mace in their hand. And so these two different profiles contribute to the understanding of Adonai as it says in Exodus 15, a warrior, a man of war, ish milchama. But it also contributes to the idea of God as your father who created you, who made you, as we see in Deuteronomy 32:6. And the animal side of this is interesting because it's one thing to tell stories about these figures who are way off in, the Northlands or in the heavens or wherever, doing all these things, but it's a lot nicer to have something nearby that we can see. And so there is anthropomorphic imagery that we find in a lot of the nations surrounding Israel, but by the first millennium BCE, anthropomorphic imagery seems to have faded away, so they use standing stones and clay figurines and things like that. But one of the ways that you represented these animals was with this symbolic animal. Ostriches, scorpions, cows, oxen. And so the ox was kind of a symbol of both El and Adonai. It was a symbol of El because oxen, like boxing, oxen and bulls were very fertile and virile. So you have in the Ugaritic literature, bull El is someone who arouses women. So a bull is fertile and virile in that sense, but a bull is also ferocious. So that's how the bull can also be related to Adonai's divine profile. the warrior profile. And so they become a pedestal symbol. So they are represented on top of that animal, riding that animal in some iconography. But they can also be absent, and the animal can still represent their presence. And this is one of the things that the Ark of the Covenant does, because God is the one who dwells between the cherubim, which are above the Ark. So the Ark is kind of the throne. And so the throne can be empty, but can still represent God's presence and reify God's presence. And I've talked about how we sometimes use headstones the same way. If we visit a deceased loved one in a cemetery, people will frequently talk to the headstone as kind of an index for that person's agency or personhood. And this is the exact same kind of intuitive logic that accounts for divine images. And so the bull, as a symbol of the deity, can intuitively kind of manifest the presence of the deity. And those intuitions become conventionalized in the rituals. And that is the subject of the book I have coming out later this year.
Well, I need to buy that book, I think.
Well, it'll be open access, so you'll be able to download a PDF for free.
Wow. When's
that coming out?
It's called Deity and Divine Agency in the Hebrew Bible, Cognitive Perspectives. It's being published by SBL Press, Society of Biblical Literature Press, and I'm hoping it comes out in 2022, but COVID has delayed the publisher quite a bit, and so they've had to push things back. So I am worried that it's going to be maybe Q1 of 2023. But don't worry, everyone will be made well aware when it is forthcoming.
Well, one question that I had kind of goes along with a little bit with what you were getting at just now. So first of all, I forgive you for destroying most of my childhood. But,
well, you're the only one. I get a lot of, you destroyed my childhood.
Yeah, so growing up in a church, Bible class twice a week and all this stuff, and memorize all these things. And so as kids, we tend to learn a lot about the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. And Nathan and I have discussed how bizarre that is, that's what we choose to teach kids. But yeah. I've one kind of thread that I keep picking up on in a lot of the things that you talk about, just because it connects to so many things, it's like a web, is the how authorship of some of these older books in the Bible are not just disputed, but it's maybe multiple authors, and one like Isaiah is maybe written by different people and over different time periods, and what has shocked me most is the development of how you can actually see the development of the concept of Judaism and Adonai and all these things throughout Scripture, and how it's how did we not see that? And the fact, and how the theory that Josiah, at the time of Josiah, that's when Deuteronomy was written. It's as though it was before time. Mm-hmm. So is there a source of anything anywhere about here's the chronological by writing date list of the Scriptures?
I've heard people talk about that before. What would the Bible look like if we arranged it all according to when we think it was written? And I don't think I've ever seen anything published like that, but there are different publications that will. There's one, for instance, that color codes the sources of the Pentateuch according to J, E, D, and P. And that doesn't change the arrangement, and there are a lot of different subdivisions within that. But there are some cool projects that are going on right now. A friend of mine is putting together a tool. It will be an online tool that will let you. They're starting with the priestly document, so it's basically provides the whole priestly document on its own. So all the chapter and verse numbers stay the same, but it skips over everything that is not a part of P. And then it's a digital text, and you can go through and they have text highlighted with notes about why this is there. And so that's probably the closest to that kind of thing that I've seen, and that's still in kind of the beta testing phase. That'll be out soon. But yeah, I think that's a gap that a number of people have noticed.
Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure how useful it would be. It's more of out of curiosity for me, just because, I'm growing up my entire life believing that the things in like the Pentateuch specifically are that's how they happened in history, and there's lots of glossing over the things that don't align and that kind of thing.
And I think one of the problems with this is that if you did divide up everything according to kind of the most widespread scholarly theories, there would be a lot of widows and orphans. In other words, there would be a lot of things that would be extracted from their context that were editorial additions that only made sense because they were being stuck into a context. And so they would not make sense if you just saw these two words out here.
Yeah, maybe it's just maybe what I'm looking for is just a heavily annotated text.
Yeah, and there are I think Friedman did his, I think it's called The Bible with Sources Revealed,
okay,
where he color coded the different sources. But if it helps you imagine it at all, the earliest writings are pieces of poetry. So Deuteronomy 32, Deuteronomy 33, Judges 5, Psalm 68, maybe Exodus 15, maybe Genesis 49. These are pieces of poetry that scholars are pretty sure, based on linguistic evidence and based on the picture of Israel that they paint, that scholars believe maybe second millennium BCE, maybe before the time of a historical, David or Solomon.
Yeah.
But if you trying to get more detailed than that, like Judges 5, the Song of Deborah, you can divide it up, but there's still, scholars who are like, verse 23 is not a part of this. And, you've got very kind of detailed arguments about, this word should be over here and this verse is, was added later. And sometimes it gets pretty ridiculous. But yeah, it would be, there have been attempts to kind of peel apart the earliest parts of Genesis, which would be parts of the Jacob cycle. And then there are other attempts to peel apart the earliest parts of Deuteronomy. So like Deuteronomy 12 through 24, many people think is, and a few fragments around that, many people think is the core of Deuteronomy that was added to later. So, but yeah, you don't have a place where you can, read all that all together. You just have these monographs where people make these very tedious arguments.
Yeah, I think the reason I as I'm thinking about it now, I think the reason I'm looking for that is one thing that did kind of shake me for a while was this entire concept of monotheism not in the Bible, and the conflation of El and Adonai. And I think it'd be nice for me to, I want to sit down and figure out how that happened and kind of watch the progression of that.
Yeah, and that's actually a book I'm working on right now that TikTok actually inspired. I'm working on a book that will be I don't know exactly what I'm going to call it yet, but it will basically be God, a Life, where I would talk about the earliest conceptualizations of deity that we find, and then how they changed, how they grew, how they developed from the earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible all the way through to the end of the New Testament, and talk about what we think contributed to these changes that we see in the text. So you can follow the trajectory of the development of the conceptualization of God from beginning to end. And I want to make this for a popular audience. not a scholarly monograph, but something that you could get on Audible or something like
That'd
that.
be great.
So, yeah, I'm working on that. It is a lot of fun, but also very challenging.
Count us in as non-scholarly audience testing. I can totally do that.
Yeah. In fact, I think a cool thing to do would be as I'm getting to the end, get some folks from TikTok or Instagram or elsewhere to help read early drafts for me and give me feedback.
Sign me up.
because I have to take those very tedious arguments and then I have to make them easy for lay readers to understand. And I think I'm developing a knack for that.
Got any final thoughts, Nathan?
I was just going to say my favorite part of this whole interview is when Napoleon Dynamite had a strong opinion on the Song of Deborah.
What?
You'll hear it when you go back later.
Verse 23 is not a part of this.
This has been fantastic, Dan. Thank you so much for what you're doing. It's good to have police on TikTok. I'm not on TikTok. I'm a Luddite. But I appreciate that there are people like you doing the good work out there.
Well, that means a lot. I appreciate hearing that. Thank you.
Yeah, and once again, a reminder for where everybody can find you. You're pretty much McClellan with the K everywhere, right?
Yeah, so, yep, pretty much everywhere. McClellan.
Yeah, and you're starting to put longer stuff on YouTube as well, right?
I am, yeah. This is a challenge. Getting into TikTok was a challenge in and of itself, and then getting into YouTube, and now I'm trying to get this better equipment going, and now I've got to learn how to edit video, and I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing there. But I don't know if you've noticed or if anybody's noticed, but every single one of my videos, there's something that I learned that week that I have added to the video. And it is basic stuff. Like if I took a course, the first week I'd already be well beyond where I am right now. But it sounds like YouTube is going to be the way to kind of develop kind of broader, longer term arguments and discussions.
Good. I'm looking forward to those.
We shall see, and one day, maybe in the future, monetization becomes a reality. Because TikTok is evidently the worst in the world.
Yeah, I have not heard good things about that.
I was going to say 5 million views and there's not monetization? What?
Well, no, I tried to join their creator fund shortly before that, but like they want tax information and all this kind of stuff, and it was processing for like 4 months.
Whoa.
And so that was when I got this enormous 5 million views video, and I was like, why couldn't I have been monetized doing that then? And now ever since it's I make like 50 cents a day. So I get to go out to a mid-range lunch every month.
Nice.
Because of TikTok.
Nice.
So,
Well,
living the dream.
exactly. Thank you for your service, sir. Hey, thanks for listening. We hope you got something out of the episode today. Check the show notes in your podcast app for all the links and references that were made, or you can find it all at followingthefire.com. If you'd like to support the show, please go to patreon.com/followingthefire to become a patron. And of course, we'd love it if you rate the podcast and share it with others. See you later.
And I'll give you all my heart. Don't you know it's all I have? Even on my heart can't compare with what you're worth. I have been running almost all my life, but you always chase me down.